This is Smashing Prohibition's Objective 1 about the initial problems with Prohibition. And if you could, go to the top of the outline, please, and jot something down for me here. The 1920s as a whole is kind of a decade where the sky is the limit. It's an attitude of we can do anything. And as a result, prohibitions of various things are going to get smashed during the decade. How we view women and the traditional view of women, African Americans, the economy, if you wanted to take it that way. Probably one of the most prosperous decades we'd ever seen in our history is marked by the idea that there is no prohibition on how much money you can make. The prohibition against human limits and how high we can reach to the sky with skyscrapers. All of these things are various prohibitions that are going to get smashed during the decade. But the one we're going to talk about here in this first part is the prohibition of alcohol, which did not go as well as the rest of these basically did. Now, this video, or this objective, is done in two parts. The first part is mostly going to be about prohibition itself, and the second one is going to get into more of organized crime. Now, if you go to letter A on the outline for a second, bear a couple things in mind, and I'm going to want you to jot something on the side here. Remember that prohibition, the prohibition of alcohol, was not a new idea. It had actually started in the Midwest as part of the temperance movement, and in the mid 1800s, shortly after the Civil War. The main reason for this, and here's what I want you to jot down, is that people would go to the local saloon out there, and they'd spend their money on gambling, or they'd spend their money on booze, or they'd go upstairs and spend their money on other things. They might even spend their money on all three things in the same trip. Then they'd go home and be physically or verbally abusive to the wife and kids after having lost all the money. So a lot of people felt very strongly that alcohol was sinful and created problems. Now again, this idea continues throughout the whole progressive era, and by the time you get to 1919, they actually do get a national amendment. A lot of states had gone dry before this, but with the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, prohibition was put in place by the Volstead Act. It was the prime tool of it. When you see that, so underline that if you would on A1A. The Volstead Act, you might come across that on an advanced placement test. It was designed to carry out the intent of the 18th Amendment. It was a little more specific. Now, this prohibition of alcohol is going to last for 14 years, all the way up to 1933, and eventually it'll get repealed, and people weren't too sad to see it go in a lot of areas, as you can see here. But the question is why did the prohibition of alcohol fail? And when you look at it, take a look at A2 and A3 here, there were places where prohibition was actually pretty popular. For the reasons you can see listed there. The rural areas of the South and the Midwest, and at that time the western states, which were still considered pretty rural, not too many major cities. In those areas, prohibition was a popular measure. Where it was unpopular was in the East, which is where the most dense city populations were. And the prime reason for this was not just immigrants, but we are an immigrant culture. And in the British taverns and the Irish pubs and the German beer gardens, beer and alcohol had long been a part of the immigrant history that was brought here over the various waves of immigration. In the big cities where a lot of immigrants settled, beer was part of what you did. But in any event, people understood that after a lot of years of temperance reforms, it was likely going to happen. So the last night before Prohibition started, liquor sales went up, and a lot of people had a lot of big parties, feeling like it was going to be the last free drink they were going to have, or at least freely allowed drink they were going to have for quite a while. But that doesn't really mean that they were going to follow the law. You can't convince people that something is a crime when for decades it really hasn't been considered as a crime, or when as you see in this picture here, people are going to go around and openly mock a national constitution, or a national amendment, I should say. People just were unwilling to do it. Take a look at this here. You've got, over on the left, you've got a police officer who's looking at this thing and just thinking it's kind of funny that you have a car going around saying stamp out prohibition. But that was the way people felt about things. Now take a look at B1 here, and I want you to jot this on the side regarding our long tradition of alcohol. We had been distilling whiskey in this country since the 1700s. George Washington himself had distilled whiskey at one point. And you remember the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Whiskey makers didn't want to get taxed on the whiskey. Doesn't sound like that big a deal today, but it was back then because whiskey and running stills and things like that, it's been a part of American culture forever. So even after the laws passed, they're not going to consider this a crime. This is kind of pushed through by the progressives in the temperance movement, and frankly, they just weren't going to follow it. Let's go down the list here under the letter B here. Let's take a look at all the different groups that were going to refuse to follow this law. Soldiers were coming back from World War I, and after their experience, they felt like, well, they wanted to have a drink. The common man, when they got off work at the factory or on the farm, wanted to be able to go have their cheap beer. The rich in their clubs wanted to be able to have their wine. And the younger generation, people from upper teens all the way into their 20s, thought it was fun to go around and find the next big party. It was kind of a sense of adventure to them to try to do things that were illegal and avoid getting caught. And frankly, it was very difficult to enforce, although I don't know how you can miss something like this, but the enforcement agencies were often staffed at the state and local levels. You didn't have too many national prohibition enforcement agencies. And the local and state officials were often, they didn't have enough guys, and they weren't getting paid very well, so it wasn't too hard to slide somebody some money to look the other way. But again, I don't know how you can miss this. On top of everything else, politicians a lot of times would during the day vote for prohibition measures because it was their job, and then go to a speakeasy at night and be part of the crowd. And everybody knew that they wouldn't turn them in or tell on them. So you've got police officers, you've got enforcement officials, and you've got politicians who are all quote-unquote dry by day, and then at night going to a speakeasy and just becoming part of the crowd and drinking with everybody else. It was well known, if you take a look at B1G here, it was well known that even the President of the United States had a drink before he went to bed every night. The bottom line, and this isn't just a lesson for this particular class or just history, but overall in society in general, if laws aren't going to be followed by the people in a democracy, then there's no point in having them. If the majority disagrees with it, they're not going to follow it, well, it's not really a law then, and change will probably happen. By 1933 it did. In the meantime, all sorts of amateurs were trying all sorts of different things to get the alcohol that they wanted. In some cases, this meant just making stuff at home. And the stuff they usually made at home, that home brew, or in some cases bathtub gin or rot gut, probably wasn't the best way to go. These concoctions, and this is fact, it's not just story, these concoctions blinded some people, and in other cases they led to death. I mean, amateurs didn't really know what they were doing, but they were feeling pretty desperate to have a drink. So where the amateurs often failed to get something relatively safe to drink or have, and it didn't stop them from making stuff during the 20s, other people turned to bootleggers. Now, bootleggers, and you want to jot this on the side under B2B, bootleggers got their name because of them putting flasks of alcohol in their boots and selling them on street corners. Now, as you're going to find out in part 2, bootlegging eventually becomes major business. But in the meantime, when bootlegging is going on, it mostly dealt with hard liquor, and that's evident on B2. The reason is because it's a lot easier to carry flasks of liquor than it would be to carry a bunch of beer. Liquor contained more alcohol and more of a punch in a smaller package, so they dealt in hard liquor more than anything else. Now, Detroit here was the prime bootlegging area of the nation in the beginning because of the Detroit River right there. This side over here is Canada, and therefore a different country, where Prohibition was not in place, and therefore alcohol was legal. So when the Detroit River would freeze over, people would go across, chased by Prohibition agents, getting the liquor that they wanted to have, and they'd sell it in Detroit and various places around Michigan, and eventually take it over here to Chicago, where it would be transported west by guys like Al Capone later on. Now, bootlegging was a major operation, but so was rum running. Now, Caribbean rum, Bacardi, Captain Morgan's, you guys would know it as today. Caribbean rum became very popular during this time as well. And rum runners would make the trip down to the Caribbean, pick up some rum, and then stop at various places along the Atlantic seaboard, dropping it off to various ports like Miami and Philadelphia, New York, Boston, places like that. Now, the leading rum runner of the time, jot this down on the side, please. Leading rum runner of the time was a guy named Bill McCoy. And he never got caught for running rum, but the government tried to make it difficult. See, people would come out in their boats and they'd meet up with McCoy and other rum runners to get the alcohol they wanted. So we extended the international boundary line to anywhere from 4 to 10 miles out to sea to make it tougher for the exchanges to happen. Well, the rum runners would go well out past the international boundary line, and people from the coastline, from the East Coast, would go out in boats, sometimes driving 10 miles out to sea to meet up with a rum runner and grab some booze, and inevitably end up with a chase with the Coast Guard on their way back in, some of them leading to gunfights and crashes. And, of course, you can't talk about Prohibition unless you're talking about the good old-fashioned whiskey still, which had been around since the 1700s. Southern moonshiners, mostly in the Appalachian Mountains, created a little illegal whiskey in these things called stills or distilleries. Sometimes they were located in forests, other times they were located in the basements of old buildings. But wherever they were made, they had to be transported. And a lot of times, in order to evade the police or the Prohibition enforcement agents, people would soup up their engines and put the moonshine in the back, traveling at night. It kind of added to the myth of the liquor that was made and moved by the shine of the moon. That's not really where it gets its name, but it kind of fits in nice. In any event, they would outrun the agents in these souped-up cars. And in 1933, when Prohibition ended, they really didn't have anything to do with these vehicles. So they started racing them. And the old Prohibition vehicles, now getting raced on dirt tracks, became the modern-day beginnings of what we know as stock car racing. That's right, it came from the South and the old Prohibition days for all you NASCAR fans out there. Now, this whole thing is going to get into a big business, which we're going to get into part 2 momentarily.